A whole new global talk show, Newstellers. Let's meet our international panelists.
South Korea reports another death. People have gone into hospital.
We start with the MERS outbreak in Korea.
So Korea has been in the midst of a MERS outbreak. It's a new virus. There's no known vaccine as of yet. We're going to start off with a special interview today. We have Dr. Daniel Lucy from the Georgetown University Medical Center on the line. Dr. Lucy, welcome to Newstellers.
Thank you very much for having me on Newstellers.
Now, Dr. Lucy, you're a renowned expert in epidemics such as MERS and Ebola. Could you tell us exactly what MERS is?
MERS stands for Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. It's mostly an infection of the lungs, so a pneumonia. It's caused by a virus that was only discovered in 2012 in the Middle East, in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and in Jordan. And subsequently, it's spread now to over 12 to 25 countries, mostly via travelers from the Middle East. And it is much less contagious than the SARS virus from 2003.
How dangerous is it really? Is the panic we've been seeing in Korea justified, would you say?
Well, it's obviously very serious disease for people who have lung disease or kidney disease or suffer from diabetes or a weak immune system. But I think that panic is probably not helpful in almost any situation with an epidemic.
Obviously, it's different in every case, but could you maybe share with us some of your experiences, perhaps with Ebola or SARS, of how you encourage a population to take those proper steps towards prevention, and what are some of the measures that you yourself encourage?
I think very important is that there's a sense of trust that's established between the health authorities and the government and healthcare workers and the general population, so that very up-to-date information can be provided about the outbreak and how to take precautions to avoid getting infected, whether you're a healthcare worker or a member of the general population.
Would you say there will be other new types of virus that can threaten the international society in the future?
Yes, unfortunately, I think there will be more new infectious diseases, particularly viruses, but also bacteria and maybe other kinds of infectious diseases. I think a new type of influenza is always a high probability because influenza mutates a lot. So we could have another severe influenza virus outbreak. Hopefully MERS will not become worse and involve other countries in a significant way as it has now over the past month in Korea. But that's a very real concern, I think, that the World Health community is afraid of. So yes, I think there will be new diseases and we have to learn from each one in the past so we're better prepared as an international community.
Okay, so we always need to be on our guard for new infections and viruses, but with the appropriate preventative measures, we can combat them. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time today, Dr. Lucy.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Soo Young.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Doctor.
Goodbye.
So any thoughts after that very insightful interview with Dr. Lucy?
Well, I'm glad we brought on someone who really is a trained professional and
Indeed.
a real expert in this. As journalists, we often have to tackle topics that we might not be really familiar with, and that involves some quick study sometimes. It also involves consulting people like Dr. Lucy, who are really sharp.
Better than pouring through all those biology textbooks.
Well, I think that's a problem. I think as journalists, we probably have all studied the humanities mostly. We come from that kind of background. I mean, there are science and medical journalists out there, but they're not the ones on the ground, you know, in South Korea, for instance, reporting on an epidemic outbreak.
Yeah, I think as a journalist covering this kind of topic is one of the most sensitive because you can really like panic people. You can provoke some panic. So it's very important to find interesting experts to know exactly what's happening and let them talk.
Yeah, and it's curious that the more you know, the less panic you can provoke, because sometimes you realize that also always the reaction of the society is higher than the real threat.
Often.
So you're all doing your part to keep the calm in Korea, so thank you.
We tried.
So groundless rumors then can prey on a nation's fears, spreading, I think, sometimes even faster than the virus itself. So let's get into today's topic on the global threat of epidemics, battling viruses, the ins and outs of control. So deadly viruses, they're nothing new. Many civilizations before us and probably after us have been plagued by illnesses of various sorts. In the 16th century, the Aztec Empire, with a total population of 300,000, was invaded by a Spanish army of 600, led by Hernán Cortés. The Aztecs won their first battle with troops that were 30 times the size of Spain's, but things changed dramatically with the outbreak of a deadly virus, namely smallpox. The Aztecs were helpless against the smallpox virus carried by the Spanish soldiers, who themselves were immune to the disease. A quarter of the Aztec population died soon after, greatly facilitating the Spanish conquest.
It was actually the biggest weapon of the Spanish.
Yeah, exactly.
Of the Spanish conquerors at that time.
Many people don't know, but
disease?
the germs that the Spanish conquistadors were carrying with them were the main reason why they were able to conquer a whole continent. I mean, the germs they were carrying went faster than themselves, so the conquistadors, they arrived in some cities that were already completely wiped out. Everybody was killed before they could even arrive.
If you've read Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, I mean, he points out that epidemics like smallpox or all these other viruses that came from Europe into the New World, I mean, that was a big reason why Western civilizations became the dominant civilization across the world, because they had built up these immunities to diseases that people in the New World just had never experienced before.
And something he says as well is interesting, that the fact that it's because the two societies were separated for such a long time that they were able to develop virus, then the other society was not immune. And I think today, in a deeply interconnected world, such kind of disease like outbreak is maybe not possible anymore.
So intentional or not, viruses are with us to stay. So the viruses themselves are a big threat, yes, but I think it's the fear that affects the public the most, those anxieties over a new or unknown virus. People start panicking. What do you think are the main outcomes when a society starts panicking over an epidemic?
Well, normal life is disrupted. A lot of times countries really see their economies suffer because things like the hospitality industry, people don't take trips, people don't go out to eat, people don't go to the movies. This fear over being in a public place, this fear over being, if we have a fear of contact with other people, that inevitably is going to be very disruptive.
And I think the rumor mill, the rumor mongering, I really think that's a product of lack of trust in government and public institutions. I think if there's no trust in a society, then this kind of makes the situation ripe for rumors to be spread around. So I think that's why we're seeing some level of panic or at least high anxiety here in South Korea during this outbreak.
Also, the tourism sector suffers a lot from those kind of outbreaks because there's a fear all over the world to go to a country where the outbreak is. So in that case, there are a lot of cancellations of the hotels and the airlines. They suffer, they go down on the stock market. So that's another different economic effect that the epidemic outbreaks have.
I think the reason why people panic so much is because the threat is invisible. It's virus, you don't know where it is. And we see recently, I'm very struck by the fact that the zombie movies and books are so popular these days. And I think there is a link with that fear, that fear of, I think it's maybe after SARS, this fear is stronger than before, I think. And I think that explains the success of this zombie movie, which is...
There have been other epidemics where it just swept throughout the world in a flash. So let's talk about some of those other examples.
SARS began in the Guangdong province of China in November 2002, enveloping Hong Kong, Macau, and Singapore. Over 5,000 cases were confirmed, and it killed 300 people in China alone. 32 countries were affected, and some countries, including the US and several European countries, temporarily blocked the entry of Chinese nationals.
I went to Hong Kong just after this broke out, actually. It was after it had died down, but I remember it was a huge, huge issue back in the day. Do you guys remember reporting on it?
I was in Toronto, my hometown, which was very seriously affected by SARS because some of the people from Hong Kong who were infected had traveled to Toronto.
Right.
And it happened right in the summer, about this time, kind of early summer, and it really decimated Toronto's economy over the summer. It just, like we've been seeing in Korea over the past couple of weeks, like just events being canceled, restaurants being empty, parks being empty. It had a really serious effect, but SARS was a very serious ailment. Yeah. It was one of the most quickly mutating strains of the RNA virus, and there was no vaccine for it. So there was a lot of panic, but I think, at least some of it was justified.
In Hong Kong, you had like apartment block where like a lot of people died. They had to quarantine, forced quarantine some apartment block, and that was really, really serious.
And actually, SARS is very similar to MERS. It's another type of coronavirus. I think that's why Hong Kong was the country that had biggest alert about this outbreak in South Korea.
Yeah, sure.
I think what is very important about SARS is it really gave us a lesson. And for example, the Chinese government initially tried to hide as much as possible to the international community, to the World Health Organization. They tried to hide what was happening. And that turned out to be a huge mistake. And they completely reversed, after they realized that it was wrong and that it was dangerous, they completely reversed their way of tackling the epidemic. And I think that was the biggest lesson of SARS, it's transparency.
SARS was perhaps the first pandemic of the internet age. And I think that allowed countries, health officials, government officials to communicate in real time using video conferencing, emails, messengers to keep track of the spread of the outbreak. And I think the way the international community tackled SARS has kind of laid down the framework and the protocols for tackling new diseases like MERS.
Yeah.
We haven't yet talked about cures. There's no known cure or vaccine for MERS yet, but luckily it's slow to spread, as Dr. Lucy mentioned. But that's not what happened with Ebola in West Africa last year. It spread like wildfire. Fred, I think you've got some information for us about that.
Yes, John. Ebola virus broke out in West Africa, devastating Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia last year. Intense measures were taken to fight the deadly virus that killed over 1,000 people. Authorities had to initiate forced quarantine in some of the affected regions, and the police and the army guarded the quarantine areas and provided aid supplies to the local residents.
Actually, in Spain, it was pretty big because Spain was the first country in Europe that got infected with that Ebola outbreak. Fortunately, we only had like 2 or 3 patients, but it caused a little bit controversial issue in Spain because we brought a Spanish priest who was infected with Ebola, and the authorities, the medical authorities, they didn't take enough measures, so a nurse was contaminated. So people started to be really, really feared of the Ebola virus going bigger. But finally, nothing has happened, and the priest died. He was an old priest that was like very sick, but fortunately the nurse survived.
Ebola is a visually horrifying disease from what I understand. I did not travel to Africa to see this firsthand, but I mean, I've heard people describe this as the closest thing to like a zombie virus. The way what it does to your body, you're bleeding from many orifices. It's a devastating disease, and I think that's what really stoked a lot of the fear about this virus worldwide. And like in Spain, in the United States, you also had politicians who also don't have any scientific background making decisions, perhaps for political gains. In my home state, New Jersey, you have Governor Chris Christie, who mandated a 3-week quarantine for all the aid workers coming back from Africa. He got into a lot of trouble. Many critics of the governor said that he was just doing this because he has the US presidency in mind, and that, by making this firm stance against Ebola, that he would somehow, win political points from doing that.
That reminds me of North Korea, actually. There was not a single case of Ebola in Asia, but still North Korea regime was so paranoid. They blocked their border to any foreigners, diplomats, NGO workers, businessmen, for many, many months, even though they had no good reason for doing that.
I think a common motivation in both of those cases that Jason and Fred just mentioned is the element of contagion, which I think when we talk about these epidemics is the most important thing. Like, there are diseases that kill people all the time. There's things like, lack of sanitation that kill people all the time. And as long as it's those people over there are dying, and there's no way that it could come to my country and affect me, I think those kinds of ailments, like children die across Africa of diarrhea and dehydration and like very easily preventable things, malaria.
Yeah.
But when it becomes a threat to the outside world, when it becomes a threat to the person who's watching this on TV or reading this in their morning newspaper, then I think we see a lot more panic and we see a lot more mobilization to do something about it.
Whether we would have seen this kind of reaction had Ebola not crossed over to the West. There are existing diseases such as malaria, one of the biggest killers in the world. You've got sanitation problems, poverty everywhere. And there were arguments that these widespread efforts were just using up resources that could be used to combat these existing problems. As you can see in the data, the death rate of malaria is much, much higher than that of Ebola.
Of course, much more people died of malaria, but the thing is, Ebola has a mortality rate much higher and a spread rate much, much, much faster.
Right.
So it's a much more immediate danger. You need to stop Ebola as soon as it stops,
Sure.
Otherwise everybody dies.
And there's also
Okay.
malaria medication you can take. I mean, malaria has been with us, has been known for hundreds of years. And right, I mean, unfortunately, it's nothing new. And I think that's why an epidemic like Ebola gets so much more attention, because it's fast moving. There is no vaccination, there's no cure, and it's such a visually disgusting disease that it really strikes people more than malaria or other more common diseases do.
And there's an element of unpredictability.
Yeah.
I mean, like, nobody really knew like just how far Ebola could go. Nobody knew like how severe this outbreak would be, and like in a time when like a disease is just breaking out and nobody really knows where it's going to go, I think as I said, the element of unpredictability colors how we perceive it and how we respond
So
to
the possibility that it could become even bigger than malaria. But some medical facilities, I believe, were being closed down, and so people that were afflicted by malaria and other diseases weren't able to receive the treatment that they needed over Ebola patients. Do you think that's justified?
That was a big problem in Africa where the last Ebola outbreak, some people were sick or some people had accidents, or so they had different diseases than Ebola, and all the hospitals were focused on Ebola, so they could not get proper treatment, and a lot of people died from other diseases because they could not get the proper treatment.
Yeah, but what do you do? Like, Ebola is such a deadly virus. It has a capacity of wipe out a full city in a couple of weeks. So how do you? I mean, you have to set up
It's
your
very difficult.
priorities. I
I
understand the problem, but I don't think this criticism are justified.
Well,
Like,
I think it's a fact. I mean, it's a fact that happened. It's very sad, but it was probably very difficult to prevent.
Well, as Dr. Lucy said, we need to look at past epidemics and see what went wrong and what didn't work out, and try to learn from them and apply those lessons to the next outbreak. So I hope, and I think we can cautiously assume that people in West Africa and other places are looking at that particular shortcoming of how Ebola was treated and trying to figure out some way to avoid that in the future. I mean, maybe you have a more firm division of departments in hospitals where the Ebola people can enter through a separate door,
Right.
and the rest of the institution can function undisturbed somewhere else.
Sure. But unfortunately, in many African countries, they don't have the medical infrastructure there to begin with. They don't have the personnel, the nurses and the doctors to make separate wards. And you saw, it was healthcare providers with Ebola, as well as even here with MERS, that are, often coming down with these diseases, are the first people to come down with these diseases.
Something that is very difficult about Ebola is there is a cultural aspect. I read in many articles that this ritual of during the funeral you have to wash the body before the funeral, and actually that's where if somebody dies for Ebola, this can spread the virus to all the family. So try to convince families to give up this ritual was and still I think is a big problem. So you can change public health infrastructure. I think that's easier than changing some customs and traditions.
All right, so we've covered various stories about some of the deadliest outbreaks in recent years, and contagion has always been a bit of a problem in human history. So I know you're not doctors, but what do you think are the best ways to prevent and manage new types of infectious diseases?
I did an interesting interview with a professor who's a specialist on infectious disease, and he told me that the one thing that he tells all of his patients in all cases is to take basic steps to boost your immune system.
Okay, such
Get enough
as?
sleep, eat properly, stay hydrated, things like that. And no matter what the ailment is or like what its means of transmission is, if you have a strong immune system, you're going to be more resistant to it and to all other kinds of health problems. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind.
Also, there's the government's role. I think it's very important. They should force the laws for keeping the hygiene in public places, in restaurants. For example, the SARS disease, it came from a market in China that they were selling some meat without any control. You know, if the government really enforces the things and the sanitary measures for trade and for everything and for the public places, I think it's a good way to prevent some diseases to come from animals to humans, or from new diseases to
teaching
appear.
people how to wash their hands, having signs in bathrooms, that remind people, please wash your hands before you exit the bathroom. I mean, having soap in public restrooms. These basic steps will keep people healthy.
And one of the good lessons of SARS, you mentioned public health infrastructure, but the second good important element I see is international cooperation. SARS really show that countries need to cooperate with each other to be more efficient in fighting disease.
Of course, and developed countries should give the means to and the knowledge to developing countries to enforce those kind of measures of hygiene and sanitation to make the public spaces safer from diseases.
Okay. So as we saw with the outbreaks of SARS and Ebola, in today's global society, it's so easy for an epidemic to quickly become a pandemic. So I think we've talked about learning from past mistakes and having effective response systems in place to help protect the public. All right, so as always, let's wrap up with our final headlines. Would anyone like to volunteer?
There's a saying that policymakers are always fighting the last war. So I would say, let's fight this outbreak and the next one.
Okay.
Epidemics, be careful, but don't panic.
Yeah, mine was closer. I would have said, don't panic, wash your hands.
Very important.
Keep your hands clean and your nose dry.
Some basic but very important advice from our panel. Thank you so much, my lovely panel. Keep safe for another week. And we will see you for the next episode of Newstellers. Join us next week, viewers, for a whole new global talk show, Newstellers. We will be open for any opinions or requests on our official website as well as our Facebook page. Other guidelines?
In any journalistic topic, the only thing that we're here to do is to tell the truth.
Shooting video from X amount of meters away, or making sure that you knew how to put on protective clothing, that you knew how to put on rubber boots and gloves.
Ebola is an invisible weapon. It can affect every journalist that is working there in any moment.
I listened to a lot of interviews. They were covering Ebola in Guinea, in Liberia. They were just following what NGO people said, like really respectful of the local rules.